So good afternoon, Professor, and good afternoon, classmate. For today, we're going to talk about the book of Esther. So why is it important and what's interesting about this book? So the book of Esther is a story of a Jewish exile named Mordecai and also his beautiful cousin named Esther. Through a fascinating set of circumstances, they were able to save Jewish people, exiled people, from the murderous plot of official Haman, an event that gave rise to the Jewish feast in Purim. But the most curious feature of this book is the absence of God's name. But despite of this glaring omission, many contend that this book illustrates God's providential control over events. But if this were the case, one would expect some references God's involvement in human affairs. Considering the narrator's point of view is helpful at this point. So the author of the story may have deliberately suppressed God's presence in order to reflect the perspective of the exiles who live in a distant land where God appeared to be absent. By masking God's presence and focusing on character's role in deliverance of the exiles, the author also emphasizes the importance of human responsibility in the outworking of God's purposes. We can ask to conclude by asking, did the exiles simply live a charmed life? Or is there more to one story than mere good fortune? From the perspective of an observer living in an exile, God was apparently absent. Yet the unfolding of events, especially in Esther's being in the right place at the right time, suggests this perspective is limited. Even when God appears to be absent, the structure of the events reveals God's presence. So the book's main literary units are arranged in symmetric pattern. So events occurring in the book's first half corresponds thematically to events recorded in the second half of the book. And then the centerpiece of the structure in chapter 5 verse 9 and chapter 6 verse 14, where the roles of Mordecai and Haman are reversed. Within this episode, the pivotal event is in chapter 6 verse 1 to 11, where the king is unable to sleep and ends up granting Mordecai the honor that Haman intended for himself. This turn of event foreshadows the book's conclusion, which tells the fate of the Jewish, which we can see in chapter 9. The dramatic and unexpected reversal in the status of Haman and Mordecai in chapter 6 verse 1 to 11 of this book foreshadows the eventual reversal in the fate of the Jews. So I highlighted, it moves from their being endangered by their enemies to the emerging success over their enemies. So the Jews' victory over enemies in chapter 9 verse 1 to 19, it contrasts within their enemies' plot against them, which we can see from chapter 3 verse 1 to 15. And the balance and hints in the story suggest that the events were not random, but part of the bigger plan, carefully guided by our God. So, by using a limited literary perspective that reflects the reality of the life of exiles, the narrator makes his point about God's presence more powerful than if he had imposed an omniscient perspective on the story. Rather than giving the readers a theological interpretation of the events, the narrator forces them to seek an answer for themselves to the question posed by the mysterious coincidences of history. So, despite appearances, God was with his people, even in that distant, remote place. Furthermore, even when circumstances look hopeless and threatening, God in his providence can provide an escape, especially when his people courageously rise to the challenge and subordinate their own well-being to that of the covenant community. So I have here two messages from the book of Esther. First, the action of Mordecai and Esther show that Jews living outside their homeland can serve God by serving their foreign leaders. However, this kind of service comes with the challenges, including the temptation to compromise with those foreign leaders' faith. As seen in the book of Esther and also in Daniel, it can also be risky. Yet governments have a significant impact on people's lives, and a God-fearing servant in such a position can bring about a great good. Second message, Mordecai is urging Esther to act for her people, especially in chapter 4, verse 13 to 14, which we discussed from our class, that this is the main verses from this book, shows the holy power comes with the responsibility to use it wisely. Esther's ethnicity could have made her a target as well, so her decision was partly about self-preservation. Regardless, she still had a responsibility to take actions. So that's my presentation for today. But for the application, I'll give it shortly. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of Esther is that she's like me, an orphan girl who was used by God to save his people. Growing up, I didn't understand my purpose in life. But as I got older, I realized I have a calling. I know I am meant to do something for my loved ones and for the Filipino people, helping them come to know Jesus. There have been many times in my life when I felt that God was absent, just like in the book of Esther, as if I were walking alone. But it is in those moments that I now realize God was quietly working behind the scenes, preparing me for something greater. Like Esther, I sometimes feel unsure about the path ahead, but I trust that God has a purpose for me, even if I can see it right away. Esther's courage to step into the unknown and making differences inspires me to also take a bold steps in my own life. Even though there are maybe moments of doubt and fear, I know that I too can be used by God to impact to other people. I am learning to trust Him more, knowing that He will provide strength and wisdom I need in the right moments. Just as Esther's action lead to the salvation of many, I believe God can use me to bring light to the lives of others, even in unexpected ways. I pray that I continue to grow in faith and courage, willing to step out in obedience to fulfill God's purpose that has set for me. So that's it. Thank you.